Hey there. I know why you're here. You're looking for a story that will help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Something calming, a little mysterious. Something that carries your mind away. Well, you've come to the right place. Before we begin tonight's journey, do me a little favor. Tap the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Even just a good night. It really helps more sleepy souls like you find their way here. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin tonight's story. Something is knocking beneath the floorboards, not in the walls, not at the door, but from a place that should be impossible, the basement, a space that was sealed shut long before anyone ever lived here. The nails in the door are rusted deep, like a warning left by someone who knew what was buried underneath. And now, night after night, the knocking grows louder, more urgent, as if whatever was once hidden is no longer willing to be forgotten. This is not just a haunted house story. This is a memory clawing its way back into the light. A voice that should not exist is calling from beneath the ground. And it knows your name. Stay with me as we descend into a mystery that blurs the line between the past and the present. And ask yourself, what would you do if the knocking came from below and your basement was never supposed to exist? The first time the knocking happened, it was so soft, so subtle, it could have been mistaken for something mundane. Maybe a branch against the siding, or the pipes rattling in the walls, like they sometimes do in older homes. That's what she told herself. Anyway, but deep down, there was a feeling that settled beneath her ribs, a sense that it wasn't the house making noise, but something inside it, something that had been waiting. The hour was late, the sky outside blank and colorless, and all she wanted was a quiet evening. But even silence, in this house, seemed to stretch too thin, and when the first knock came from beneath the floor, her body froze before her mind caught up. There was no mistaking it once it happened again. 3 knocks, patient and deliberate, like a coded message from something that remembered her before she remembered it. The basement had always been a mystery, not an interesting one, like a hidden room or a forgotten safe, but a quiet mystery, one that lived behind a nailed-shut door at the bottom of the hallway, where no air moved and the light never reached. It wasn't just locked, it was sealed, as if someone didn't want it opened. Thick, rusted nails were driven into the frame like a warning etched in iron. It had been like that since she bought the house. The realtor mentioned water damage, or maybe asbestos. She couldn't remember now. It didn't matter then. It was just a basement. She never needed it. She didn't even own enough things to store. But now something inside it was making itself known. The knocking was steady, unnervingly calm. 3 sharp thuds, a pause, and then 3 more, as if it had all the time in the world to wait for her to finally listen. She stood at the top of the hallway for a long time that night, listening. Her mind searched for rational explanations, like fingers groping in the dark. Pipes, maybe the wind, a raccoon, even, somehow trapped inside. But it wasn't any of those things. It didn't sound like something moving around randomly. It sounded like someone, or something, trying to get her attention. The knocking was always the same, measured, calm, repeated. Not frantic or wild. It was the steadiness of it that made her blood cold. The sound had a rhythm, and rhythm meant awareness. Rhythm meant intention. And worse than the fear of what might be beneath her was the crawling thought she couldn't shake. It's been there the whole time, hasn't it? Waiting, listening, learning how to mimic something human. She didn't sleep much that night. Every creak in the floor, Every sigh from the walls made her heart race. She left the lights on, all of them. The house felt like it was watching her, waiting for her to admit she'd heard it. The next morning, sunlight made it easy to pretend she'd imagined it. No knocks in the daylight, nothing strange. She even laughed at herself for getting so worked up. But when night came again, so did the knocking. Same pattern, same timing. She didn't go near the door this time. She sat on the edge of the couch, gripping a blanket, staring down the hallway like it might suddenly open on its own. And the worst part was, she found herself waiting for it. Not because she wanted it, but because part of her knew it would happen again. By the third night, she couldn't pretend anymore. She placed a chair at the end of the hallway and just sat there waiting. Her phone in hand, her body tense. She didn't know what she was waiting for. Proof, maybe. Something she could show someone else, as if that would make it more real. But when the knocks started again, she couldn't move. It was like the air got heavier. The moment pressed down on her lungs, making it hard to breathe. The knocks were louder now, not just heard but felt, like pressure vibrating up through the floor. They rattled something loose in her chest. A memory, maybe. A name she hadn't thought of in years. The kind of name you don't say out loud anymore. Not because it's dangerous, but because it hurts. She called her sister the next morning. She didn't bring up the knocking. She just asked about the house, about the area, the history. Her sister brushed it off. "You always hated being alone," she said. "Maybe you're just not used to the quiet." But the house wasn't quiet anymore. It had a heartbeat now, and it was coming from below. That day, she stood in front of the sealed basement door and really looked at it for the first time. The nails weren't part of some half-finished repair. They weren't recent. They looked decades old, rust spreading like veins. Whoever sealed it didn't want anyone going in, or anything coming out. She reached out, touched one of the nails. It was colder than the air. She pulled her hand back. Her fingers smelled like soil. That night, she slept with her bedroom door locked, as if that would help. The knocks didn't come at their usual hour. She stayed awake until well past 3 in the morning, waiting, listening, but they never came. And just as she began to feel foolish again, just as her eyelids began to drift, the sound echoed through the house. Not knocking this time, but something worse. The sound of footsteps, soft, slow, moving across the basement floor, moving toward the stairs, and then silence. Not a peaceful silence, not relief, but the kind of silence that only comes when something has stopped moving because it's listening for you. The silence after the footsteps was unbearable. It stretched on for minutes that felt like hours, thick and heavy like fog inside her ears. She didn't dare move, didn't breathe too loud. The sound hadn't come from behind the door. It had come from below it. Not a dream, not a creak. Actual steps, measured and slow. She thought about calling someone, but who? And what would she say? Something is walking beneath my house, but the basement is sealed. It sounded ridiculous, even to her, but it didn't feel ridiculous. It felt real in the way only nightmares are real, when you know you're trapped in them, but you can't wake up. She lay awake until sunrise, not blinking, watching the hallway as though any second, now something would appear at the end of it. She tried not to think about the old stories her grandmother used to tell, the ones whispered at bedtime that always ended in loss, in silence, in things that waited beneath floorboards. and behind closets. She had chalked them up to culture, to superstition, to the kind of stories that kept children from wandering too far into the dark. But now, those tales didn't feel distant, they felt inherited. She didn't feel like a grown woman anymore. She felt like a child again, clinging to sheets and trembling from the things that waited just beyond the edges of light. She began to question everything. Had the basement always been sealed? Had she ever tried to open it herself? Had someone warned her not to? The fourth night, she tried something different. She brought her phone closer and recorded the sound when the knocking came. She crouched by the door, her heart hammering harder than the knocks themselves. She pressed record. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. She held her breath the entire time. Afterward she played it back, but what she heard wasn't the knocking. It was whispering, just under the surface, a voice layered beneath the knocks, like a shadow behind a curtain. The whisper was warped, almost drowned in static, but it wasn't random. It was saying something, repeating a phrase. She played it back over and over, until it became impossible to unhear. Let me out. Let me out. That was the first night she truly panicked. She deleted the recording, then immediately regretted it. She wasn't ready for anyone else to hear it, but part of her already knew it would come back. She tried blasting music, wore headphones to bed, slept with a nightlight like she hadn't done since she was 12. But it didn't stop anything. It just made her more aware. Now the knocks came earlier, sometimes just after sunset, other times at random hours of the night, like it was testing her, waiting to catch her off guard. The pattern never changed. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. But now, it wasn't just sound. She could feel it. The vibration would ripple through the floor, like a minor tremor. Glasses in the kitchen would rattle slightly. And worst of all, her body would always react before her mind, as if it knew, as if some part of her remembered. She visited the hardware store that weekend and asked questions she didn't know how to phrase without sounding paranoid. She asked about concrete, about soundproofing, about old houses and structural echoes. The employee gave her a strange look when she described the door, nailed shut with no hinges, no handle, just bolts and rust. He said basements like that were rare. Maybe a storm cellar, he suggested, or an old storage well. Some folks sealed off areas when they thought it was cursed ground or unstable. Cursed. The word stuck to her like a bruise. On her way home, she passed by a church and wondered, not for the first time, whether she needed something more than logic. She hadn't been inside one in years, but that night she found herself whispering prayers she barely remembered, to a God she wasn't sure, still listened. By the 5th night, it wasn't just knocking. There was scratching now, light at first, like fingernails against wood, then deeper, like claws against stone. It came from underneath the door, just below where the final nail had sunk into the frame. She crouched again, not to record this time, but to listen. She didn't understand why. Maybe she needed confirmation. Maybe she wanted to believe she wasn't insane. But when she leaned close, pressing her ear to the wood, what she heard didn't sound human. It was breathing, not the sharp inhale of panic, not the shallow wheeze of fear, but something slow and thick and hollow, like something with lungs too large, or no lungs at all. And then it spoke, not in words but in shape, a sound that knew her name. She fled from the door, heart crashing in her chest, mouth dry, body cold. She wanted to leave the house entirely, grab her keys, get in the car, and never look back. But her legs wouldn't move. She stayed curled on the kitchen floor until morning light pushed through the windows. When she finally stood up, she noticed something strange. One of the nails in the basement door had shifted just slightly. It wasn't pulled out, but it wasn't flush with the wood anymore. Like something inside had been pushing against it, testing it. The sight of it hit her harder than the knocking, because it meant that whatever was down there was getting stronger. She tried to convince herself that the nail had simply loosened over time. Old wood shifted, houses settled, but it didn't explain the breathing. It didn't explain why she could still hear that sound even now, hours after dawn, echoing softly in her ears like the memory of a scream. She watched the door from the hallway, her feet planted just far enough to run if it opened, but close enough to see if anything moved. It didn't. Not yet. The silence now was almost worse than the knocking. It felt like something was calculating, as if the thing behind the door had learned patience and was now waiting for her to make the next move. Her body felt like a cage she couldn't escape, constantly on edge, always listening. She hadn't slept in over 48 hours, but every time she tried to close her eyes, she could feel it watching her from beneath the floor. That day she tried to go out. She got in her car, backed down the driveway, and drove to the edge of town. But the further she went, the louder the whisper in her head became. She couldn't explain it. It wasn't a voice exactly, but a pressure, an impression, like a shadow trying to take form. She pulled into a grocery store parking lot and just sat there for a long time, staring blankly at her hands on the steering wheel. Something was tethering her to the house. Not fear, something deeper. A pull, like gravity, like grief. She tried to remember why she'd even bought the place. It had been impulsive. Cheap, a quiet neighborhood with no real history. But now she wondered if she had found the house, or if it had found her. When she returned home, the air inside felt different, thicker, like the walls had inhaled and were holding their breath. The basement door remained sealed, but something had changed. The hallway was colder, noticeably, and this time when she touched the doorknob, even though it didn't turn, she felt heat, a pulse, as if something living was behind it. She yanked her hand away and stumbled backward, staring. She knew she needed help, real help, not a priest, not a ghost hunter, not a friend to tell her she wasn't losing her mind. She needed answers. She started searching public records, anything about the house, the address, previous owners, but all she found were gaps, years unaccounted for, owners listed, then suddenly missing, names scratched out of city records. It didn't make sense. Houses didn't just erase themselves. She made one last call that night. A local historian she found through a community forum, someone who'd archived news about the area for decades. The woman agreed to meet the next morning. They sat across from each other in a small coffee shop. When she gave the address, the woman grew quiet, too quiet. Her fingers stopped moving across the paper. "That house," the woman murmured, her eyes darkening. "It's older than you think. That land was never meant to be built on. The original home burned down in the 40s. People said they heard screams from under the ground. But when authorities searched it, there was nothing there. No basement, no records, just scorched earth and stories no one wanted to write down." She felt the floor drop beneath her. "There's a reason the blueprint doesn't list it," the woman added. "That basement doesn't belong to the house. It was already there." She left the coffee shop shaking. The air outside didn't help. Everything suddenly felt unfamiliar. Her skin itched, her teeth ached, as if her body was trying to reject the truth it had just absorbed. The house wasn't just haunted. It was anchored to something old, something that had been buried, but not dead. That night, she didn't go to bed. She sat on the hallway floor, across from the basement door with every light in the house turned on. She held a flashlight and a kitchen knife, neither of which made her feel any safer. She sat there for hours, staring at that door, waiting for it to knock again. But it didn't. Instead, for the first time, it spoke. It wasn't a full sentence, just a sound, a word barely audible, but enough to freeze her veins. It said, almost. Just that. One word, one promise, one chilling truth. It wasn't trapped. It was waiting, testing, getting closer. She could feel it in the walls now, in the static when she turned on the TV, in the flicker of lights that used to be steady. She thought about the phone call she never made, to her sister, to anyone. It was like the house had made her forget, like it was isolating her, one memory at a time. And the more she gave in to fear, the more real it all became. The boundaries between her and the thing behind the door were thinning. She tried sleeping on the couch again, tried pretending none of it was happening. But that night, the knocking didn't come from the basement. It came from inside the living room wall, just inches from her head. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. She screamed. The sound shattered the silence like glass. Her voice felt foreign, like it belonged to someone else. She ran into the kitchen and turned on every light, panting, heart pounding so violently, she thought it might tear through her ribs. She stared at the wall where the knocks had come from, and then she saw it, right where the drywall met the floorboards. A thin crack, just wide enough to slip a finger through. It hadn't been there before. She didn't sleep at all after that. See, her world was unraveling. One floorboard, one whisper, one memory at a time. The basement wasn't just a room. It was a mouth, and it was opening. The days no longer felt separate from the nights. Light didn't bring safety anymore. It only made the shadows quieter. By now, the house had become a living thing, a hollow shell that breathed beneath her feet. The walls moaned sometimes, and not from age. The mirrors reflected things that weren't there just a second before, and the knocking, it had spread. No longer confined to the sealed door, it began traveling, migrating like something testing the boundaries of its prison. First the walls, then the ceiling, and eventually the floor directly beneath her bed. The rhythm never changed, never hurried. It knocked like it knew it had all the time in the world. She started counting her steps each day, counting every object in the house, anything to tether herself to the idea of reality. But the numbers never stayed the same. The house kept changing. She thought about leaving, packed a bag one night, stuffed it with essentials, and opened the front door. But the air outside felt wrong. Still, thick, too quiet. As if the world had paused while the house continued. The neighborhood looked the same, but the street lamps flickered in patterns, and the wind didn't move the trees. She stood on her porch for a long time, unsure if what she was seeing was real or another illusion the house had conjured. And when she turned back around, the basement door was open. Not wide, not swung violently, just slightly ajar. Enough for her to see the black behind it. Not darkness, black, something without depth, without end. She didn't remember dropping her bag. She didn't remember walking back inside. All she knew was that the moment she closed the door again, the knocking stopped. for the first time. The silence stretched for 3 days. She didn't sleep, but she didn't hear anything either. The absence of sound made her suspicious, paranoid. She started feeling phantom touches, soft brushes of cold air along her arms, breath against her neck while washing her face, the weight of something unseen sitting on the edge of her mattress. She began talking to herself out loud, just to hear a human voice in the house. But eventually she realized she wasn't alone in her conversations. When she stopped speaking, she'd hear faint mimicry, echoes of her own words repeated hours later. Words she never said out loud repeated in the static of the television. Laughter, quiet and breathless, trailing behind her in the hallway. It wasn't mocking her, it was learning, adapting, trying to become her. The mirror was the final betrayal. She caught the first glimpse by accident, a reflection that lingered half a second too long. Her own face, but not her. The mouth didn't move when she spoke. The eyes didn't blink, it just watched. She covered every mirror in the house after that, even the screen on her phone. The thing behind the door wasn't just knocking anymore. It was studying, reaching, replacing. The house had become more than haunted. It had become a gate, and now something was stepping through. She found claw marks on the inside of her bedroom closet, scratches on the back of the TV, her own handwriting on the refrigerator, but it wasn't her grocery list. It said, "Let me in." On the 7th night, the power went out. Not just in the house, on the entire block. She watched from her window as every home on her street blinked into blackness at once, like someone had unplugged the whole street from reality. The basement door creaked, not loudly but purposefully. She lit a candle with trembling fingers and stared down the hallway. The door wasn't just open this time. The nails were gone. Every one, no trace of rust or splintered wood. It was as if they had never existed, and from inside that doorway she heard it breathing again. Closer than ever, wet, rattling, slow. Then it spoke again, not just a whisper, a voice. It said, "You sealed me in. You don't get to forget me." She backed away slowly, stumbling, unable to look away from the open door. There were stairs now, long descending ones that had no end in sight. And for the first time something began to emerge. A shape, crouched and twitching, crawling its way upward like a shadow stretching into flesh. She couldn't scream, couldn't speak. Her mouth wouldn't move. It reached the threshold and stopped. She couldn't see its face, only the outline, only the hand it raised. 5 long fingers, nails like broken glass, and pressed gently against the wall beside the door. Then it disappeared, not back into the darkness, but into the walls, into the floor. The basement was empty now, because the knocking wasn't coming from below anymore. It was already inside. She didn't leave the house after that. She stopped answering her phone. She let mail pile up by the door. Neighbors stopped knocking, or maybe they just forgot she existed. The house was quiet again, but not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that hummed under your skin, the kind that settles in your bones. She spends most of her time now sitting in the hallway, staring at the sealed door that no longer has any nails. Sometimes she hears a voice in the floor whisper her name in her own tone. Sometimes she hears it laugh, but mostly it just knocks. 3 times, a pause, 3 more, and she's no longer sure if the knocking is trying to get in or trying to remind her that something has already gotten out. The house had become a quiet accomplice. It no longer protested, no longer groaned under pressure or sighed in the early hours. It simply watched, In the days that followed the final nail disappearing from the basement door, there were no more footsteps, no more scratching, just silence. But the silence itself had changed. It wasn't emptiness, it was memory, a thick, suffocating presence in the walls, like the house had inhaled her fear and was now holding it in its lungs. She moved differently now, not out of caution, but out of respect. As if the floorboards beneath her weren't just old wood, but something with a spine, something with thoughts. The fear no longer lived in her head, it lived in the structure, and she was simply its guest. Each room had started to feel like a version of itself. Not wrong, not twisted, just slightly off. She'd find objects moved an inch to the left, lights left on that she was certain she turned off, the hum of the fridge, slipping in and out of frequency, like it was trying to say something in code. The mirrors remained covered, yet she swore she could hear them whispering behind the cloth. And the hallway, the one that led to the basement door, seemed longer now, as if stretched in the night, while she slept. Sometimes she'd walk it and feel like she was moving through something alive. The air thicker, the shadows slower to fall. She didn't even pretend to lock the basement door anymore. What was the point? The door hadn't kept it out. She hadn't kept it in. She tried recording herself while she slept. Her phone placed carefully on the nightstand, camera facing her bed. She watched the footage the next morning. The first hour was still. By the second hour, her chest began rising and falling faster. She never tossed or turned. Her body just stiffened, but the audio was worse than the image. Just beneath the static of the room, just barely, was breathing, not hers. And then a sound like someone crawling slowly across carpet. She scrubbed through the timeline, heart pounding. At 3:12 a.m., the blanket near her feet pulled downward, just a few inches, as if a hand had grasped the edge, then retreated when she stirred. She paused the footage. She couldn't bring herself to delete it. It was the closest thing to proof, and it was also a warning. It no longer needed the basement. Something new began to happen after that. Memories she didn't remember having started surfacing. Not dreams memories, flashes of another home, another door, another night, a basement in another house, another place, another life. She saw herself younger, pale, dirt under her fingernails, a hammer in one hand, nails in the other. Someone was screaming, not at her, from below. She always woke up before she heard the voice clearly, but she knew it was the same rhythm, the same knock. She tried writing it all down, tried to piece together whether what she was remembering had actually happened, or if the house was feeding her stories to keep her from sleeping. Either way, she was unraveling. Her grip on what was real was fraying like fabric left out in the rain too long. She called her sister again. No answer. Left a message. Simple, rehearsed. Call me back. I think something's wrong with the house. She never mentioned the basement, the knocking, or the door. She didn't want to sound unhinged. She told herself that if her sister heard the desperation in her voice, that would be enough. But the call never went through. The next day, her phone had no call record, no voicemail history, nothing, like it never happened. She checked her laptop. Emails were gone, drafts missing, text deleted. Even the calendar app was empty. No reminders, no notes, no version of her life before the knocking remained on any screen. The house wasn't just inside the walls anymore. It had entered her history. It was curating her life. And then came the photographs. She didn't own many, but the few that she had framed on the shelf, tucked in drawers, had changed. In one, her sister was missing. In another, a photo of her as a child. The background was no longer her childhood home, but this house, her current living room, with the basement door blurred in the distance, just barely visible. She stared at them for hours, trying to figure out if it had always been that way. Had she just not noticed? Or was the house rewriting things piece by piece, molding her past to fit its shape? She looked at her own face in the photos. It was still her, but not the same her. The eyes were wrong, colder, like the version in the photos already knew what was waiting in the basement. And then the knocking returned. Not loud, not even in the house. It came from inside her head. Soft at first, a mental echo. 3 dull thuds, a pause. 3 more, not painful, just present. Like a message being tapped from the inside of her own skull. She pressed her hands to her ears, curled against the wall, tears burning in her eyes. The house wasn't haunted. It was sentient, and now it was inside her. The worst part wasn't the knocking in her head. It was the stillness that followed, because that silence too began to mean something. Not peace, not calm, but compliance, like something inside her was learning how to stop resisting. The thudding behind her eyes came and went. Now, not always accompanied by fear. Sometimes it was almost soothing, familiar. She started to expect it, even missed it when it didn't come. She would catch herself standing in the middle of a room, staring at a blank wall, waiting to feel it again, like waiting for a heartbeat. And when it arrived, 3 dull knocks, a pause, then 3 more, she would let her body still, let it settle. It had stopped asking for her attention. Now it was simply reminding her, we're still here. Things inside the house began to vanish. Small things first. Socks, light bulbs, batteries, then food, then entire drawers. It wasn't sudden. It was patient, surgical. She'd walk into the kitchen and find that the spice rack had 1 bottle less, or that the hallway now had 1 picture frame fewer. At first, she thought she was forgetting, misplacing things. But when she opened her closet one morning and found it completely empty, clothes, hangers, boxes, all gone, she knew this wasn't about misremembering. The house was stripping her, peeling her life away piece by piece, not out of malice, but preparation. It was making space, not for something new, but for something old, something she had once tried to bury. She spent one entire night pulling every board from the basement door, not because she wanted to open it, but because she wanted to understand it, to face it. There was no lock, no mechanism, just a flat surface, smooth now, like it had been molded from the wall itself. No knob, no seams, nothing to grip. It didn't even look like a door anymore, just a darker patch of wall, rectangular, faintly breathing. She sat in front of it for hours, whispering things to it, demands, pleas, questions, but it never responded, not with sound, not anymore. The knocking had moved past that. It had evolved. It no longer needed the door or permission. The dreams came back stronger than ever. Only now they weren't fragments. They were memories, whole, vivid, relentless. In them she was back in a house that looked like this one, but felt much older. She was younger, barefoot, covered in dust and sweat, hammering nails into wood, while someone screamed behind her, a voice pleading through the boards, begging to be let out. The voice wasn't angry. It was familiar. Someone she loved. Someone she knew. But she kept going, nail after nail, until the screaming stopped, until all that was left was silence. And then the knocking began. In every dream, it ended the same way. She would seal the door, turn away, and then hear 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more, always in perfect rhythm, as if it never blamed her, as if it only wanted her to remember. One morning, she found a note slid under her front door. No envelope, no name, just a folded slip of yellowed paper with one line scrawled in ink. "You promised to never forget." Her throat closed around the words. Her hands trembled as she read it again, not because the handwriting was unfamiliar, but because it wasn't. It was hers, her own script, her own phrasing, but she had no memory of writing it, no memory of leaving the message for herself. She tore the paper in half and tossed it in the bin. But the next morning it was back, unfolded, clean, waiting on her nightstand. No wind could have placed it there. No prankster could have known the exact wording. She stared at it until her eyes watered, and then reluctantly she whispered, "I remember." The moment she said it aloud, the candle on her dresser flickered once and the lights in the hallway turned off by themselves. She didn't leave the bedroom for 2 days. Her body felt weaker, as if the house had drained her strength, just enough to keep her docile. The walls made soft sounds, scraping, whispering, murmuring syllables that sounded half-formed, not sentences, just reminders, names, dates, a lullaby her mother used to sing, a knock-knock joke she hadn't heard since childhood, things only she would recognize. It was no longer trying to scare her, it was trying to pull her back, not from madness, but from forgetting. It was reconstructing her memory, using everything she'd tried to erase. And worse, it was working. She began talking to it again, to the house, not in anger, but in confession. "I didn't mean to," she'd whisper into the dark. "I didn't know what would happen." And sometimes when she paused, the house would answer, not in words, in breath, in pulse, in rhythm. On the 12th night, she stood before the wall that had once been the basement door. Her hands trembled, but not with fear, with recognition. She wasn't afraid anymore, because she knew what was waiting behind it. Not a monster, not a ghost, not something buried, someone, a part of her. A truth so deep and old she had sealed it away to survive. But now it had grown, learned, lingered, and it no longer needed the door, because the knocking was no longer asking to be let out. It was inviting her to come down. She didn't remember walking down the stairs. One moment she was staring at the space where the basement door had once been, and the next, her feet were sinking into something cold. The air grew heavier with each step. It wasn't darkness that surrounded her. It was absence, a void that devoured light and memory alike. Yet it didn't feel unfamiliar. Her body didn't resist the descent. It welcomed it, as if it had always known this place, as if it had once belonged here. The stairs were longer than they should have been. She stopped counting after the 50th step, and yet she kept going. The deeper she went, the louder her own thoughts became, not echoing, but overlapping, as if another voice inside her head was remembering along with her, guiding her, urging her forward. "You made it. You're almost back." At the bottom, there was no door, no wall, just a vast, low-ceilinged room that pulsed like a lung. The floor was made of dirt, soft, freshly turned and scattered with nails. Not rusted, not old, clean new, shiny. They glistened in the faint red light that seeped from somewhere unseen. The walls were smooth, like they'd been molded by hand, and in the center of the room stood a single chair, child-sized, wooden-stained. The air stung her skin. Every breath came with a taste, metallic, like blood and salt. She wanted to turn back. but her feet stayed rooted. Something inside her had been waiting to come back here, long before she ever moved into the house. And now that she had returned, it had no intention of letting her leave unchanged. She remembered now, not in fragments, but in full. The first time she'd heard the knocking was years ago. Not in this house, but in another. A farmhouse, a storm, her mother screaming, her father pounding on the door to be let out. Only it wasn't really him. That's what they told her. That's what the whispers had said. It looks like him. It sounds like him. But it isn't him anymore. And so she had obeyed. Nailed the door shut while her mother cried in the corner, rocking back and forth, repeating prayers that didn't work. She had hammered each nail in herself. Small hands, splintered palms, her brother watching from the stairs with wide, wet eyes. The door never burst open. It never fought back. But the knocking continued every night, until they moved, until her mother stopped speaking, until the memories were buried deeper than the door itself. It hadn't been a haunting. It had been a hiding. The thing behind the door had never left. It had followed them, followed her. And now that she'd grown older, lived her life, moved from place to place, it had found a new basement, a new threshold. And it was no longer content with being remembered. It wanted her to understand, to accept what she had done, to see the shape of it, to name it. She stepped toward the center of the room, and as she moved, the walls shivered. The chair was waiting. She knew what it meant. She didn't sit, not yet, but she knelt beside it, brushing her fingers against the seat, and saw her own name carved into the wood. Not carved as an adult would, but jagged and crude, like a child trying to claim something before it was taken away. That's when she saw the shadow, not on the wall, not in the corner, but beneath her skin. A flicker behind her reflection in the puddle of black water at the far end of the room. She crawled toward it, compelled, and looked down into her own face. But it wasn't hers. It was the child version, hollow-eyed, splinters in her cheek, blood on her hands, lips trembling but not from fear, from guilt. The child stared up at her and whispered a single word. Remember, and then the knocking resumed. Not from the walls, not from the ceiling, but from inside her chest. A hollow thud. 3 times. A pause. 3 more. Her hands pressed to her ribcage, as if to quiet it, to deny it. But the sound was steady, patient, like it had always been. She sat in the chair, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. It felt too small now, but her body fit as if molded to its shape. The room darkened, the dirt floor rose slightly, like the earth itself was exhaling. The knocking grew louder, not in volume, but in presence. It no longer came from one direction. It came from everywhere, above, below, behind her teeth. And with it came the voices, not screaming, not angry, just calling. Names she didn't know she'd forgotten, faces she hadn't seen in years. The basement wasn't a place. It was a memory made solid, a vault of guilt and silence that had taken form. And now that she had returned, it was no longer trying to escape. It was trying to merge. She didn't scream when the floor began to open. She didn't fight when the shadows reached up from the dirt. She didn't run when her name was spoken in 5 different voices. She only cried, quietly, softly, because she finally understood. The knocking had never been a threat. It had been an invitation, a request for her to return to the moment she tried to forget. And now, seated in the center of the place she had sealed away, surrounded by the echoes of everything she'd lost, she finally whispered back, "I remember you." The moment the words left her lips, the knocking stopped. The dirt stilled, the air cleared, not because it was over, but because it had begun. When she woke, she was back in her bed, fully clothed, her hands covered in dirt, her nails splintered and black. The sheets were damp with sweat or blood. She couldn't tell which, but her body remembered the stairs. Her muscles ached in places that hadn't been used in years. The sound of knocking was gone. For now, the house was quiet again. But it wasn't the old kind of quiet. It was the kind of stillness that follows a ritual, as if something had shifted into place. A debt partially paid, a promise remembered. She sat up slowly, her breath catching in her throat as she looked down at her palms. The lines of her hands had changed. They were deeper, etched, as if time had folded in on itself and left behind scars shaped like choices. She found a trail of black footprints leading from her bedroom door to the hallway, barefoot. Her own, each print slightly different than the last, like someone or something had walked beside her, step by step, merging into her shadow. The hallway lights no longer flickered. The mirrors, still covered, now pulsed faintly from behind the cloth. She didn't need to uncover them to know what they would show. Not her, not entirely, but a version of her that had stayed behind in the basement. The version that had sealed the door, the version that never left the chair, that became the knocking. She whispered a name she couldn't recall ever learning, and from somewhere in the walls, something exhaled. The note was waiting for her on the kitchen table. The same yellow paper, same handwriting, but now a different message. Now you remember. What will you do next? Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The question wasn't meant as a threat. It was a choice. She could pretend again, go about her days, seal the door once more, bury the memories under comfort and silence, or she could listen. Let the house speak. Let the knocking finish its sentence. She held the paper against her chest for a long time, eyes closed, remembering the sound of the nails falling one by one, remembering her father's voice, if it was him begging not to be forgotten. And now, with the house breathing slow and steady around her, she knew that the decision had already been made, the night she first heard the sound beneath the floor. She started talking to the house. Not loudly, just a whisper as she walked through the rooms. She told it about the dreams, about the old house, about the chair. She didn't expect answers, but the walls always replied in kind, in shifts of air, in the rustle of unseen movement, in the creak of floorboards that responded to her voice. She wasn't alone. She hadn't been for a long time. But now, it no longer felt like an invasion. It felt like a reunion. The knocking had never been a stranger trying to get in. It had always been a memory trying to come back home. And now that it had, she began to understand that this house was no longer just shelter. It was a vessel for her guilt, her silence, her unspoken sins. The next night, she stood before the wall that had once held the basement door. She reached out and touched it, not to test it, but to greet it. The surface was smooth, cold, and pulsing faintly beneath her fingertips. She spoke softly. I remember you. I know who you are now. The wall pulsed once in response, then again, a rhythm, a knock. But this time it wasn't asking to come in. It was echoing her voice, not as mimicry, but as memory, a reflection. For the first time, the house wasn't haunting her. It was becoming her, and she was becoming it, not possessed, not overtaken, but aligned. The house had waited for her return. Now it waited for her direction. She began writing things down, every detail of her dreams, every shift in the house, every word spoken from within the walls. It wasn't obsession. It was remembrance, a ritual of acknowledgement. The house responded. The knocking became less frequent, but more deliberate. Not just knocks, messages. She started understanding the patterns, where it knocked, when what it went. It was language. It was alive. And more than that, it was ancient. She wasn't the first to live here, but she might be the first to listen, and that made her something new. Not a victim, not a prisoner, but a witness, a vessel, a voice for something that had been sealed and silenced for generations. On the 13th night, the knocking stopped completely. Not because it was gone, but because it no longer needed to knock. The door wasn't sealed, the past wasn't buried. She had answered, and now, the house was hers in a way no deed or mortgage could ever claim. It lived through her, and she through it. The echoes in the walls were no longer strangers. The silence had changed again. Not empty, not hollow, but full of intent. The kind of silence that listens. She could feel it when she walked across the floors. Now the way the wood gave beneath her weight, just slightly, like it was acknowledging her presence. The house had stopped knocking, but it hadn't gone still. If anything, it had become more alive. The shadows no longer retreated at dawn. They lingered, clinging to corners as if waiting for her to speak first. The air carried a weight that wasn't oppressive, but attentive, like it was waiting for direction, for confession, for the next layer of memory to peel back and reveal the truth underneath the floorboards. She heard the first whisper while brushing her teeth. Not through the walls, through the plumbing. A faint, murmured phrase bubbling up through the pipes. Her name, just once, barely audible. A sound that wasn't water, wasn't air, just voice, from somewhere deep inside the structure. She didn't flinch. She only stared at herself in the mirror, at the covered glass now humming beneath the fabric. "I'm listening," she whispered to the sink, and the pipes responded, not in words, but in rhythm. The drain gurgled once, then 3 times. A pause, then again. It wasn't trying to scare her. It was learning how to speak. The next morning, she found her journal open, even though she hadn't touched it. A fresh page had been torn halfway through, a message scrawled in thick graphite at the top. "Not everything you buried is dead." She ran her fingers over the words, and the pencil smudged beneath her touch. Fresh, undeniable. Not a hallucination, not sleepwalking, a conversation. One that had been happening long before she'd realized. One she had begun answering in dreams, in gestures, in forgotten words. The house wasn't haunting her, it was teaching her. And each message, each whisper, each sudden rearrangement of reality was pushing her closer to a moment she had long buried under layers of silence. The floorboards in the hallway began to creak in rhythm, even when she wasn't walking on them. Late at night, they tapped out patterns. She began transcribing them. Knock, 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 pause, knock. At first it was nonsense. Then, over time, she started recognizing repetition, like a code, like syllables rearranged into a primitive language. She mapped the knocks across paper, marking where they echoed and when. And then one night, after a long sequence of tapping beneath her bedroom door, she whispered a word she hadn't used in over a decade. "Brother." The air in the room shifted. A draft swept under the door, soft and cool and filled with recognition. The knocking stopped, as if stunned. Memories returned like static, disordered, sharp, painful. Her brother's voice calling out from behind the first basement door. His fists pounding, not in rage but in confusion. He had been sealed away not because he was monstrous, but because something else had taken hold. Something that wore his skin like a shroud. And yet, part of him had remained. Trapped, waiting, not just in that basement, but in every home she had lived in since. The knocking hadn't followed her. He had, not as a ghost, not as vengeance, but as a voice she had refused to hear. Until now, the house had made it impossible to ignore, because it was him, or what remained of him. In the wood, in the wiring, in the echoes beneath the floorboards, she began sleeping with her ear to the floor. Each night, she pressed her cheek against the cool wood and listened. Sometimes, the whispers returned. Other nights, it was breathing. But every time, she stayed longer, let herself drift in and out of sleep with the sound of something alive just inches beneath her. It no longer frightened her. It grounded her. It reminded her of the boy with the cracked front tooth and the laugh that echoed through summer afternoons. Of the boy who had once grabbed her hand during a storm and whispered, "Don't let it take me," and how she hadn't known what he meant until it was too late. Now, decades later, his voice had returned, not to accuse her, but to remind her. He was still knocking, and this time she had the choice to open the door. The house gave her one final message that week. A shape formed in the dust on the coffee table, where no one had touched it. A fingerprint, then another, small, familiar, and beside them, drawn in a child's uneven scrawl, was a word, ready. She traced it with her finger. Her hand didn't shake. Her eyes didn't weep. She simply nodded into the silence, because now the voice beneath the floorboards wasn't just calling to be heard. It was calling to be found. She answered the house in rituals, not chants or candles, but simple, deliberate acts, placing a photograph face down beside the baseboard, pouring a glass of water, and leaving it untouched near the foot of her bed, whispering into cracks in the wall, things she hadn't told another soul. Every movement became part of the rhythm, an offering, and in return the house responded, not always with sound, but with feeling. Warmth in the floor when she mentioned his name, a breeze through closed windows when she remembered his face. Her grief was no longer a wound, it was a bridge, and on the other side of it waited something that had knocked for so long, not to escape, but to come home. She no longer feared the night. It became her sanctuary. The hours when the house spoke most clearly, the language had evolved beyond knocks now. It breathed into the vents. It clicked through the old heating system. A forgotten music box inside the closet began playing on its own. Always the same melody, always at 3:12 a.m. The time she remembered sealing the first basement door all those years ago. She let the melody play, didn't interrupt it, because it belonged to him. A tune he used to hum as a child, tapping it on windowsills and radiators and bathroom tiles. That rhythm had become the knock. That song was the code, and she had missed it for far too long. One morning she awoke to find the walls covered in chalky handprints, small, childlike, faint but unmistakable. They trailed across the hallway, over the light switches, down the sides of door frames. None of them were her own, and yet they didn't feel foreign. She walked past them slowly, tracing a few with her fingertips, and felt warmth, not heat, presence. As if those hands had been reaching, not in fear but in recognition. He had never tried to hurt her, not even when she locked him in. He had only tried to reach her, to be remembered, to not be erased. The house, now his resting place, had become an archive of everything she tried to bury, and now she could finally see it for what it was. A shared memory made physical. Her dreams deepened into something more than visions. They became interactions, spaces, moments she could move through. She saw herself again, as a child, this time sitting beside her brother at the top of the basement stairs, their legs swinging in the air. No fear, no voices from below, just the two of them, quiet, content. He turned to her and said, "You forgot the end of the story." She tried to ask what he meant, but he pressed a finger to her lips and pointed to the floor. There, on the wood, was a single word carved into the grain. "Forgive." She jolted awake, the word still echoing in her mind. She found it the next day, actually carved into the living room floor, where none had been the day before. The house had remembered too. Her own reflection became strange. After that, not in the frightening way it had before, but in quiet, uncanny moments. She'd catch glimpses of her younger self in glass, herself at 8, at 12, at 17, lingering for a breath, too long before snapping back into sync. Each time, there was a softness in the eyes, not warning, not fear, but an invitation, as if the house, or whatever lived within it, was giving her permission to revisit herself, to speak to the version of her that had done the sealing, to show that child she was not to blame. The guilt had lived too long inside her, twisted and fed by years of silence. But now, the reflections were asking her to let go, and letting go would mean opening the door, not physically, spiritually, emotionally, through memory. She took the journal one night and wrote her brother a letter. She didn't know if it would be received, but she wrote it anyway, page after page, apologies that trembled, memories that stung, moments of guilt wrapped in love and silence. She signed it with her full name, something she hadn't done in years, and placed the journal at the base of the covered mirror in her hallway. Then she turned off all the lights, laid down on the hardwood floor, and closed her eyes. That night, the house did not whisper. It sang, faintly, in a voice almost too soft to understand, but the words were there, echoes of her letter, echoes of his laughter, echoes of the story they never finished telling. In the final hour before dawn, the floor beneath her cheek warmed gently. A pulse rose through the wood, not a heartbeat, not a knock, just one clear word, spoken without sound, yet heard deep in her chest. Soon, she whispered back, "I'll be here." And this time there was no need for knocking, because now he knew she was listening. She began to feel it in her bones. Him, a presence, threaded into her limbs, like echoes of an old lullaby. She hadn't realized she remembered. The house no longer startled her with signs of his nearness. It comforted her. When the floorboards creaked, she paused to listen. When the windows fogged, despite the warmth, she pressed her fingertips against the glass and whispered his name. The air would respond with a shiver, a hush, a breath that was both memory and message. The knocking had ended, but its rhythm had passed into her. Every beat of her heart carried it. 3 thumps, a pause, 3 thumps, and now she didn't dread it. She breathed with it. One morning she woke up with dirt under her nails. Not from gardening or sleepwalking. She hadn't moved. Her body was perfectly still, but the filth was fresh, cold, and damp. She stared at her hands, and in a strange, chilling peace, understood. She was returning to him without even leaving her bed. In dreams, in mind, in some deeper form. The separation between house and memory, body and spirit, past and present. It was thinning. The boundaries she had spent her life upholding were dissolving like old paper. This wasn't just haunting, it was merging. She was becoming a vessel not just for remembrance, but for resolution. Her guilt had called him, but her acceptance was keeping him. The neighbors noticed, or rather, they noticed her. At the grocery store, in the post office, even the barista who never looked up from her register, everyone hesitated when they saw her now. Some glanced at her, like she was someone they almost recognized but couldn't place. One older man, passing by as she stepped out of her house, nodded and murmured, "You're back, though." He clearly didn't know why he'd said it. The town felt different, like it had remembered something too. The road seemed older, the trees more still. Even the wind felt like it carried stories she'd once tried to forget. She didn't fight it. She didn't explain. Some truths were meant to be carried quietly, like flowers to a grave. One afternoon, she opened the basement wall, not physically, but spiritually. She sat before it, palms against the surface that used to be a door, and spoke her brother's name with her whole chest. "I'm ready," she whispered. "Tell me the rest." The wall didn't move. The floor didn't tremble. Instead, the house became still, profoundly still, as if it were holding its breath. Then the wall began to warm. Not burn, not glow, just thrum, like a heartbeat meeting hers. She closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her eyelids, the house unfolded, not as it was, but as it had been. The old rooms, the old voices, her brother's laughter, and then the final moment she had buried deep beneath fear and grief, the day she closed him in. But this time, the memory changed. He wasn't screaming, he wasn't fighting. He stood there calmly, pressing his hand to the other side of the door. She saw herself crying, hammer in hand, begging him to understand, and he nodded. Once, slowly, he let her do it. Not because he wanted to be sealed away, but because he knew she was afraid, and he chose to protect her. Not from himself, but from whatever else was rising behind his eyes. She saw it now, in the memory. A flicker of shadow curling up his spine, slipping behind his voice. A presence, ancient and cold, and he chose to contain it. With his own body, his own silence. He'd never been the monster. He'd been the lock. Tears blurred her vision as she pulled her hands back from the wall. Her brother hadn't been knocking to be freed. He had been knocking to remind her of the choice he made, of the price he paid to protect her from something she couldn't see. She felt ashamed, but more than that, she felt honored. He had trusted her. Then, and now, the knocking, the memories, the merging. It wasn't haunting, it was return. She stood slowly and whispered again, this time, not into the house, but to him. "I remember what you did." The lights flickered. The air warmed, and in the hallway mirror, beneath the cloth she hadn't dared touch in weeks, something moved. That night, the music box didn't play. The house didn't creak. No pipes whispered. And yet, she wasn't alone. Her brother's presence filled the space, like a second heartbeat. Calm and patient, she laid in bed and opened her eyes to the ceiling, knowing he was near. There was no need for sound now, no knocking, no signs. He was no longer below the floor. He was beside her, within her, and the fear that once shaped her entire life had melted into something ancient, bittersweet, and beautiful, remembrance without pain. She awoke to the sound of humming. Not a music box, not the pipes. It came from the walls, low and gentle, like a child trying to remember the tune of a song they used to sing. She didn't flinch. She listened. Each note threaded through her skin like breath, curling around her spine. The melody was familiar. She'd heard it before in a dream, or maybe once, long ago. when she sat beside her brother under a storm-dark window, his head resting on her shoulder as thunder rolled above them. He had hummed that same tune then, a song without words, a lullaby for two frightened children pretending not to cry. Now the house sang it back to her, not as comfort, as recognition. The sound moved through the walls like a tide, not demanding attention, but reminding her she was no longer alone. She wasn't the only one remembering. The house too was singing in grief, in apology, in longing. The covered mirror in the hallway called to her. She hadn't touched it since she moved in. It had always felt wrong, too cold, too watchful. But now she approached it like she would a grave, slowly, reverently. The cloth trembled as her hand brushed it, not with fear, but with memory. She pulled it down in a single motion, exposing the glass beneath. At first there was nothing strange, just her reflection. Parlor, older, still, but then the surface began to soften, not ripple, not distort, just give, like a sheet of glass beginning to breathe, and behind her reflection, something else came into view. A second face, smaller, gentle-eyed, not a ghost, not a threat, just him, standing behind her, patient as ever. His gaze met hers through the mirror's veil, as though he had always been there, just waiting for her to look long enough. She didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the glass. Her brother's reflection stood with hands at his sides, head slightly tilted, watching her the way he always had when they were children, like he was waiting for her to decide what came next. His mouth didn't move, but she heard his voice anyway, not in her head, not in the room, in the mirror. "You're not done." She nodded once, her throat tightening. She whispered, "I know," and he smiled, soft, fleeting, almost sorrowful. Then the glass shimmered, dimmed, and his image faded, leaving her alone again with herself. But something remained etched faintly into the silver, at the edge of the glass. A word, below. She leaned closer. It wasn't scratched or written. It was formed, as though the mirror itself had remembered what it needed her to see. She knew it didn't mean the basement. Not anymore. This wasn't about geography. It was about depth. The past, the roots beneath memory, the foundation beneath guilt. There was still something she hadn't faced, something neither of them had. And now that the knocking had quieted, the house was pointing her deeper, into the part of the past that preceded the ceiling, the moments that led to the door. She'd spent years haunted by what she had done, but the house knew she was strong enough now to face why. And that question, why she had been forced to lock him away, had never truly been answered. Not by her, not by him. The mirror had merely opened the next door. Her breath caught as she realized this was never about guilt alone. It was about truth. The story she'd told herself had always been incomplete, and the house, piece by piece, was giving her the rest. That night, she sat on the floor, back against the cold wall that had once held the sealed entrance. She closed her eyes, placed both palms flat to the boards, and whispered, "Show me what I forgot." The air responded with a hush. The house stilled, and then her breath caught in her throat as the scent of earth and damp wood filled her nostrils, not from outside, but from inside her own lungs, like she was breathing the basement itself. And with that breath came the memory. She saw her childhood room, the storm, her mother's trembling hands. But this time, she heard something new. Another voice, one that hadn't been in any of her dreams. A voice from beyond the door that wasn't her brother's. Cold, calm, familiar, in a way that chilled her bones. "Let me in," it said, and she remembered now, not just what she'd sealed away, but what had tried to come through him. Something ancient, patient, something that had spoken in her brother's voice, worn his face, but never belonged. That was the truth. That was what had come first. It hadn't been her brother she sealed away. It had been the thing that tried to become him. The thing that spoke with his voice but moved wrong, looked wrong, felt wrong, and he had let it in, accidentally, innocently, as a child might. A game, a wish, a dare made in the dark. He'd invited it in, and it had worn his skin like clothing. But some part of him had fought back, and it was her little self, who had recognized the difference, who had known something was wrong, even when no one else believed her. She had made the decision not to punish him, but to protect him from it, from whatever lived behind the voice that came with the knocking. And she had succeeded, but at a cost. The sealing had worked, but so had the forgetting, and now to finish it, she had to remember everything. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but they weren't from pain, they were from clarity, from finally seeing the whole picture. The knocking had never been just her brother reaching out. It had been both of them, him and the thing he trapped inside himself, both locked away, both waiting to be acknowledged. And now that she remembered, now that the house had shown her what lay beneath, she knew what she had to do. Not open the door, but finish the sealing. Not to forget, but to honor, to give her brother the peace he had been denied, to give herself release from the weight of all those silent years, and to put the voice, the real voice, the ancient, lurking one back into the silence where it belonged. She pressed her forehead to the wall and whispered a final goodbye, her voice steady but trembling with truth. "You don't have to knock anymore." Behind her the mirror dimmed, the lights flickered once, then settled. The floor beneath her feet warmed, just slightly, and in the distance, somewhere below the floorboards, came one last sound. Not a knock. So, not a whisper, just a breath, deep, satisfied, at rest. For the first time in years, the house stood still, not waiting, not reaching, just there, holding her. She stayed seated for hours after, palms still against the wood, forehead to the surface. Until the sun rose, she did not move, because in that final silence, in the space where knocking had once begged for attention, something else now lived. Peace, earned, shared, complete.
The silence didn't feel like peace anymore. It felt like waiting. In the days that followed her final whisper at the wall, the house settled into a stillness so profound it became oppressive. Not loud, but full, heavy, like walking into a room just after someone has left. Their warmth still clinging to the furniture, their scent still hanging in the air, but no one to be seen. That's how the house felt now, like it had been emptied out, but not vacated, like the knocking had been masking something else. And now that the sound was gone, that something had the space to surface, the floors still creaked beneath her feet, but not as communication, as complaint, as warning. The air was colder, but not from weather, from withdrawal, as if the house itself had exhaled something it hadn't meant to release. She began hearing whispers, not in the walls but in the wood itself. When she placed her hand flat on the dining table, she swore she could feel a vibration, a tremor too fine to be physical. And when she leaned in, her ear nearly against the wood grain, it was there. Voices, dozens of them, speaking in fragments, broken phrases,
old dialects. Some sounded like pleading, others like lullabies, but most were unrecognizable, not just in language, but in tone. She'd never heard anything human that low, that thick, that dry, as if the wood was remembering something, and the memory itself had rotted. She pulled her ear away and stumbled back, heart hammering, breath shallow. The knocking hadn't just stopped, it had been replaced. The dreams changed too, no longer soft memories of her brother or childhood. Now they were maps, abstract, muddled, always showing the same thing. A room beneath the house that didn't exist. A chamber too large to fit below the basement, with walls made of brick soaked in something black. She always stood in the center of it, barefoot, surrounded by voices she couldn't see. Sometimes they circled her, other times they just watched, always whispering, always waiting. She would wake up covered in sweat, throat dry, fingertips tingling like they'd touched something electric. One morning, she found her sheets stained with reddish dirt, just at the edges, like her feet had walked through soil that shouldn't have been there. She checked the floor. Nothing. No dirt. No prints. But the whispers had grown louder by then, humming softly through the walls like distant wind. She tried to ignore it, tried to read, to cook, to pretend life could return to the version she had known before the knocking began. But the house no longer accepted distraction. Every book she opened fell to pages filled with symbols, not printed, but drawn. Every radio station returned static, and in that static, buried under layers of white noise, she heard a chant, repeated, familiar. It took her a week to recognize the words, "Come below, come below, come below." The whisper wasn't inviting, it was summoning. Not just her, something else. Something else was being called, and she was the one who had accidentally started the call. Desperate for understanding, she went back to the box of old items in the attic, the one filled with photos, letters, keepsakes from the past. She had avoided it until now, afraid it might stir something dormant. But the house had already done that. She lifted the lid and sifted through the fragments of forgotten years. One envelope, yellowed and sealed with wax, caught her attention. It had no name, no address, just a symbol drawn on the back, a circle with 4 lines piercing through it like nails. The same symbol she had begun to see etched faintly into the corners of the mirror, burned into the wood near her bed frame, and traced in dust on the windowsill. She opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single sheet of parchment, one sentence, handwritten. The sealed things remember who sealed them. That night, she lit every candle in the house, not for protection, but for light. She needed to see what was moving in the corners now. She needed to face it. The whispers didn't fade in the presence of the flames. They clarified. The voices no longer scattered. They gathered. She sat in the center of the living room, journal open, hand steady, and listened for hours. And what she wrote chilled her more than anything she'd heard before. The voices weren't all strangers. Some of them were hers. Her childhood voice, her teenage voice, her adult voice, whispering things she'd never dared say aloud. The house was speaking in her own memory, twisted, fragmented, but true. The wood didn't just whisper, it reflected. And then finally came the message she had feared most. Not spoken, not knocked, written, scratched faintly into the wall behind the sealed basement. The door was never meant to hold just one. She stared at the words, none. The meaning sank in slowly. The basement hadn't been a prison for her brother. It had been a threshold, and by sealing him in, she had closed herself out. But now that threshold was waking again. not to free him, but to finish something older, something ancient, something unfinished. And this time, it wasn't just knocking, it was coming. She began to understand what true dread felt like. Not panic, not terror, but a slow, consuming erosion of certainty. The kind that hollows you out from the inside, leaving only instinct. The house had changed. It was no longer a haunted place. It was aware, not like a mind, but like something ancient with memory. It creaked in language. It settled in warning. It exhaled unease. Every sound was too deliberate. Every silence was too deep. She moved carefully now, speaking less, listening more, as though her voice might provoke something she could no longer claim to control. The once familiar rooms felt taller, narrower, as if the house were reshaping itself, or perhaps revealing what had always been underneath the ordinary. The wood no longer whispered just to her. It echoed her. She stopped sleeping, not because of fear, but because sleep pulled her too far inward. Dreams were no longer a safe place. They had become corridors, tight, endless, pulsing with breath and shadow. Sometimes she woke up, not in her bed, but sitting upright in the hallway, or curled near the old stairwell, as if something had led her there, or drawn her there. Her journal, once a refuge for her thoughts, now filled itself. Words appeared overnight in her own handwriting, though she never remembered writing them. And worse, the entries began referring to her in the third person. She went back to the door today. She still doesn't know what waits behind the boards. She will remember before the wood splits. It was no longer just about the basement. Something beneath it was writing through her. One morning, she found a piece of wood at her doorstep, a plank, rotten, splintered, the nails still embedded, and written in faint black across its face. One piece removed, 3 remain. She didn't know who had left it, or how they knew, but the message was clear. The ceiling was weakening, not just metaphorically, physically. She ran her hands along the boards covering the basement door. They were cold now, wet to the touch, and the grain trembled beneath her fingers, not with life, but with movement, as if the wood was under pressure from the inside, as if something was pushing, not pounding, not knocking, pushing with slow, deliberate force, no longer requesting to be let out, but preparing to force its way through. She spent that day researching the house, tracing deeds, previous owners, any mention of it in newspaper archives or town records. What she found chilled her more than anything the whispers could have said. The house had been rebuilt 3 times on the same foundation. Each time the structure above had burned, been abandoned, or mysteriously collapsed. And each time the basement remained untouched. It was as if the ground refused to let it go. One entry from the early 1900s mentioned the land had once been consecrated by silence, a phrase repeated in 2 different records, almost 20 years apart. What did it mean? Who had consecrated it? And what had required silence as its only holy offering? That night, she returned to the wall. She didn't speak. She simply sat, candles lit, journal on her lap, palms flat to the floor. She didn't try to summon her brother. She knew now he was beyond reach. He had been a lock, a guardian, but the thing beneath had waited long enough. It wasn't angry. It was patient. That was what made it terrifying. Its hunger wasn't rage. It was inevitability. It didn't want out. It was simply meant to be. And now that it had been acknowledged, it was reclaiming space, rewriting the rules of her reality. She could feel it in her teeth, in the curl of the wallpaper, in the flicker of the lights. Reality was thinning, and she was standing at the weakest point. The next morning, she heard the whisper again, but this time not through wood or in her sleep. It came from the radio, clear, direct. One voice, layered beneath static, speaking 5 words. The foundation remembers the blood. She turned it off, unplugged it, but the phrase stayed in her head, over and over. It didn't make sense. Not until she found the old photograph, buried beneath the stairs, one she'd never seen before. In it, a group of children stood beside the foundation stones, long before the current house had been built, all of them smiling, all except one boy, who stood apart, pale, unsmiling, eyes entirely black. On the back of the photo, scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting, he heard it first. Her brother hadn't been the origin, just the most recent listener. That evening, the boards on the basement door moaned for the first time. Not loud, not dramatic, just a soft, steady groan, like joints stretching after years of stillness. And something in her understood. It was nearly time. Not for a haunting, not for punishment, but for inheritance. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. And she, by staying, by remembering, by listening, had become part of its memory. She had made herself known to the thing beneath, and in doing so, she had invited it back. The whisper that followed her up the stairs was not in English, but she understood it all the same. The whisper followed her into her dreams, not as a voice this time, but as a presence. It stood at the edge of the dream world, tall and unmoving, its shape unclear, more shadow than form. It did not speak. It did not step forward. It only watched. And though its eyes were never visible, she felt them fixed on her like 2 holes drilled straight through her mind. It wasn't her brother. It wasn't anyone she had known. It was the thing underneath everything. The thing that had waited through decades of brick and drywall and silence. In the dream, the floors above collapsed one by one until only that presence remained, waiting in the dust, humming the lullaby she'd once believed belonged to her brother. But the voice had never been his. It had only worn him like a voice print. And now, it wanted her to wear it, too. She woke gasping, covered in sweat, her bedsheets soaked as if she had been submerged. All around her, the house creaked in a slow, rhythmic pattern, wood shifting in a way that almost sounded like breathing. She rose to her feet, her joints aching, her limbs heavy. The hallway lights flickered as she passed. She didn't reach for the switch. It didn't matter anymore. The house knew her now. It had stopped hiding what it was. The mirrors no longer reflected properly. The clocks ticked backward at random. Even time had begun to lose its shape, but she no longer feared it. She was past fear, past reason. There was only truth now, and it lived in the bones of the building. The journal wrote itself again that day. This time full pages appeared as if etched by invisible hands, shaky, jagged, frantic. It told the story of a place that had never belonged to people, of land buried under rituals and silence, offerings of blood and memory. It spoke of a voice that came from below language, one that lured children with familiar songs and spoke through mirrors to mothers too tired to question. The house had always been a listening post, not built for living, but for observing, watching generations forget what once lived beneath them. The knocking hadn't been warning her. It had been reminding her that what was sealed never stopped wanting. Later, as the sun began to fade behind grey clouds, she returned to the foundation. Not the wall, not the sealed door, but the floor. She pulled back the carpet in the hallway, then pried loose the boards beneath it. They came away too easily, as if they'd been waiting for her hands. Beneath them was not soil, not stone, but another layer of wood, older, darker, etched with carvings that pulsed when she touched them, not in heat, but in rhythm. As if a heartbeat lived below, she pressed her palm to it, and for the first time she heard not whispers, but words, spoken not aloud, not in her mind, but in her bones. It remembers you. Her breath shuddered out of her, and she recoiled from the floor, but it was too late. The connection had been made. The house had reached her, not with fear, with recognition. Every moment of silence she'd endured, every knock, every dream, every chill, it had all been part of a conversation she hadn't known she was having. She was no longer merely inside the house. She was within it, an organ in its body, and the entity, the one who had worn her brother's voice, who had waited beneath, had never been gone. It had only been sleeping. She now understood. Her presence was not disturbing it. Her presence was waking it up. The windows wouldn't open anymore. The doors jammed. The phone played only static. Even the wind outside seemed muted, muffled by something pressing against the walls. The world had dimmed, turned in on itself. She could still see the outside, but it no longer felt reachable, like the house had been peeled away from the rest of reality and set adrift on a tide of memory and breath and wood. She tried to write, to scream, to cry, but everything felt rehearsed, like it had already happened before. The fear, the silence, the weight of the house settling around her shoulders. It had been lived, not just by her, by others. That night, she found the second plank at the foot of her bed, just like the first. Old, rotten, marked, 2 pieces removed. 2 remain. She didn't touch it. She didn't scream. She sat beside it and waited for morning. But morning didn't come. The sky remained dim, stuck in a perpetual dusk that gave nothing but half shadows and a faint, reddish glow. The basement door no longer moaned. It breathed, not the sound of it, but the feel, as if the house was preparing for labor, as if something was readying itself to emerge. The house held its breath, and she felt it, like a pulse in the floorboards beneath her feet. The silence was no longer empty. It was full, full of waiting, watching, and something ancient stirring just beneath the threshold. The walls seemed to lean in, their shadows stretching and darkening, as if the house itself was pulling tighter around her, enclosing her in a cage of wood and whispers. She tried to stand, but her legs trembled, as if the floor had shifted beneath her, uncertain whether it would hold her or swallow her whole. She was no longer a visitor here. She was part of the house's story now, and the story was far from finished. At the edge of the room, the sealed basement door pulsed faintly, the boards humming with an energy she could feel in her bones. The nails holding them were loose, and a faint light leaked from the cracks, thin as spider silk but persistent as a heartbeat. She reached out with trembling hands, fingers brushing the edges of the wood. It vibrated softly, like the echo of a voice trying to speak through centuries of silence. Her breath caught as a whisper rose, barely audible, but unmistakably clear. Remember, the word was a command and a plea, an invocation of memory and truth. The house demanded it, the entity beneath the floor demanded it, and she, finally, reluctantly, understood what was being asked. Her fingers found the carvings beneath the hallway floor again, the strange symbols that pulsed with life. She traced them slowly, feeling the cold wood beneath her skin, the hum growing stronger with every touch. The carvings were a map, a language, a ritual woven into the very foundation of the house. Each symbol was a key, each line a path leading downward, down past the sealed door, past the dirt and stone, into the depths where light could not reach. And there, she knew, lay the heart of the house's secret, the place where the entity had first whispered its name, where it had woven itself into the bones of her family, and where it had waited for her all along. Tears spilled down her face, not from fear, but from a profound sadness. The house was not a prison, it was a womb, a place of birth and death, memory and forgetting. The knocking had been the first breath of something awakening, the whispers the slow unfolding of a story, long buried beneath layers of wood and silence. She realized now that the basement door was not a barrier to keep something in. It was a seal to keep something safe. Safe from the outside world, safe from her, safe from the past that refused to stay buried. The entity beneath was not just a threat, it was a part of her lineage, a shadow cast by generations of silence and secrets. To open the door would be to release more than just a haunting. It would be to unravel the fabric of her own existence. The night deepened around her as she sank to the floor, hands pressed to the trembling boards. The air grew thick with the scent of earth and old wood, and the whispers rose into a chorus of voices, soft, mournful, insistent. They sang of loss and longing, of promises made and broken, of a bond forged in darkness and blood. She understood then that she was not alone in her struggle. The house held the memories of those who had come before, ancestors who had faced the same shadow, who had tried to lock it away, who had failed and succeeded in turns. Their voices were carried in the grain of the wood, in the pulse beneath the floor, in the silence between the knocks. And now their story was hers to bear. With a final shuddering breath, she made a choice, not to open the door but to honor it, to protect the boundary that had kept the darkness contained, and to hold the memory of her brother and the entity both with tenderness and truth. She whispered a vow into the heavy stillness, "I will remember, and I will keep the seal." The house responded with a soft sigh, the vibrations fading, the light dimming to nothing. The door settled back into silence, the nails fastening tighter, as if relieved to hold its secret once more. The whispers retreated into shadow, and the house exhaled a long, slow breath of peace. But peace was fragile, and the story was far from over. As dawn's pale light filtered through the curtains, she knew this was only the beginning of a deeper journey, one that would lead her further into the heart of the house's mysteries and into the dark legacy that waited patiently below. The knocking was gone, but the house was still listening, still waiting, and so was she. The house no longer whispered. It was silent, but the silence was heavy, a dense fog that pressed into every corner and seeped under the doors. It wasn't peace. It was a thick, suffocating weight that filled the air like the calm before a storm. Each room seemed to breathe with a quiet menace, the walls closing in just a little tighter with every passing hour. She moved through the house carefully, as if her footsteps might shatter the fragile barrier holding back something ancient and restless. The wood beneath her fingers was cold and damp, and when she pressed her palm flat against the floorboards, she could feel a faint, rhythmic pulse, as if the house itself had a heartbeat, slow and deliberate. It was a beat that echoed from the sealed basement door, deep beneath the surface, calling out from a place she dared not explore yet. She clung to routine, hoping the mundanity of daily life might stave off the creeping dread. Yet even the simplest acts were distorted by the house's presence. The kettle's whistle was hollow, the steam rising like ghostly fingers that dissolved before they reached her face. Plates clattered too quietly in the sink, and the creak of the stairs sounded like a groan of protest from the wood itself. Night brought no rest. Instead, the ceiling above her bed became a shifting tapestry of shadows, elongated and twisted beyond natural form, as if unseen shapes were reaching out just beyond her vision. In sleep, she was trapped in corridors that twisted and folded endlessly, haunted by blurred faces and whispered promises. Her dreams became a landscape of fragmented memories and fractured time, leaving her breathless and grasping for clarity at dawn. Fragments of an old story began to surface in her dreams, visions she hadn't known she'd buried so deeply. Towering trees loomed over her, their branches rustling in an ancient tongue she could not understand. The earth beneath her feet was soft and black, rich with decay and secrets. Somewhere far off, a faint flicker of light glowed, a campfire, a candle, or perhaps something older. The voices she had heard before now coalesced into a single haunting chant that resonated in her chest, urging her deeper into the darkness. They spoke of bloodlines and promises made in shadow, of bonds forged in silence and kept through sacrifice. Each time she tried to follow the chant, the dream shattered with the coming of morning light, leaving her with a hollow ache and a sense of something lost beyond retrieval. Desperation drove her to the town archives, searching for any trace of the house's history or the land it rested upon. What she uncovered was scant but disturbing. The records spoke of disappearances, mostly children whose names were whispered in fear and sorrow. Old maps bore strange symbols, drawn in ink that had faded but never vanished completely. There were references to secret gatherings held in groves nearby, rites performed to protect the living from whatever lurked beneath the soil. A century-old article described the area as cursed, where the earth resists disturbance and silence is the only sanctuary. The house was no mere building, it was a sentinel, standing guard over something buried deep and dark, something that had claimed victims long before she arrived. While cleaning the attic, she found a bundle of letters tied with a brittle, faded ribbon. The ink was smudged, the handwriting shaky but desperate. These letters were voices from the past, residents who had come before her, whose lives were stained with the same fear and silence. They wrote of noises from below, of feeling watched, and of a presence that whispered promises of power and protection for a price. One letter ended with a warning scrawled in trembling script. Do not break the seal, do not listen to the knocking. The silence is our only protection. Her hands shook as she folded the fragile papers. The past was bleeding into her present, and the quiet that had descended was less a blessing and more a countdown to something she wasn't ready to face. That night, the whispering returned, not through the house's walls or floors, but inside her own mind. The voices wove a soft, insistent melody, urging her to remember a promise made long ago, to honor a pact sealed beneath the earth and wood. The boundary between herself and the house blurred until it was impossible to tell where she ended and the building began. Thoughts that were not entirely hers drifted through her consciousness, memories that felt like ancient echoes reverberating in her blood. Then came a new sound, a slow, rhythmic tapping, not knocking, but a heartbeat, steady and unyielding. It came from behind the basement door. It was a call, a summons, waiting for her to answer. Her heart thrummed in time with the tapping, each beat growing louder in her chest until it drowned out all else. The house was no longer just a place to live. It was a living thing, connected to her through every breath and every tremor of the wood. And beneath it all, beneath the sealed door, and the layers of dust and memory, something was waking. Something patient, ancient, and hungry. The silence was broken, but what came next was still unknown, waiting, watching, and ready. The tapping persisted, a steady rhythm beneath the floorboards that matched the quickening beat of her heart. It wasn't just sound, it was a presence manifesting, growing stronger, as if whatever lay beyond the sealed door was calling out, not just through wood and stone, but through the very air she breathed. Every moment the tapping grew louder, resonating in her bones and filling the spaces between thoughts. She could no longer tell if the noise was external or a reflection of her unraveling mind. Sleep remained elusive, replaced by a relentless awareness that the house and its buried secret were entwined with her very being. Days passed in a blur of half-waking moments, where reality felt unstable and shadows clung to her like a second skin. The boundaries between past and present, dream and waking life, blurred into one continuous stream of unsettling images and sensations. She found herself drawn to the basement door repeatedly, fingertips tracing the worn edges of the nailed boards, nails now rusted and loose. Each touch seemed to weaken the barrier, as if her presence was unlocking something that had been sealed for decades. The voices in her head grew louder too, shifting from whispers to urgent cries, voices pleading, warning, begging her to listen, to remember, to act. One evening, as twilight bled through the curtains, a sudden cold filled the room. The house groaned as if in pain, and the floor beneath her feet rippled like water. Then the knocking began again, but softer, slower, deliberate. Not frantic or angry, but a measured tapping that carried a weight beyond comprehension. It was a communication, a language she felt but could not understand. She knelt beside the door, pressing her ear against the wood. The sound matched her own heartbeat, steady and persistent. It was not a call to fear, but an invitation, an ancient rhythm that promised revelation and reckoning. The next morning, she discovered a new marking on the basement door, etched deep into the wood, glowing faintly in the dim light. It was a symbol she had seen before in the attic letters, a circle crossed by 4 lines like a compass rose. The meaning was unclear, but the glow pulsed softly, almost like a heartbeat. It was a warning, or perhaps a guide. She traced the lines carefully with trembling fingers, feeling the energy hum beneath her touch. The house had shifted again, revealing another layer of its secret. She realized with a sinking heart that she was no longer an observer, but a participant in a story written long before her time. A story bound in silence, blood, and memory. Determined to understand, she returned to the town archives, poring over records that stretched back centuries. She found references to the original landowners, families who had vanished mysteriously, their homes abandoned or destroyed by fire. Stories of ritual gatherings to bind a presence beneath the earth surfaced, rites performed by ancestors who had tried to contain a force older than memory. The land was said to be sacred and cursed, consecrated by silence to keep the darkness locked away. The house was built upon this foundation, both protector and prison, and the sealed basement door was the last defense. But something had weakened the seal. Her brother's fate was only the beginning. That night, she sat alone in the living room, candles flickering and shadows dancing on the walls. The whispers filled the air once more, a chorus of voices both familiar and strange. They spoke of promises made in the dark, of pacts sealed with blood and silence. The house breathed around her, alive with memory and waiting. She felt herself slipping, the boundary between self and house dissolving into the night. The tapping grew louder, louder still, until it was a thunderous pulse beneath the floor, shaking the very foundation. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the rhythm, to the weight of the house's history, pressing down on her soul. In the depths of that night, she dreamed again, this time descending into the earth beneath the house. She walked through tunnels carved from stone and roots, walls inscribed with symbols that glowed faintly with otherworldly light. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and something else, something ancient and alive. Voices echoed through the corridors, guiding her steps toward a chamber bathed in shadow and silence. In the center lay an altar, stained dark with old blood and forgotten tears. The presence she had feared was there, waiting, patient, eternal. It did not speak, but reached out with an invisible hand, inviting her to remember, to join, to become part of the story that could never be undone. She awoke with a start, the house silent once more, but the echo of the dream lingering like a wound. The tapping had ceased, leaving only the heavy stillness and the knowledge that what lay beneath the sealed door was no longer content to wait. She was bound to it now, tethered by blood, memory, and silence. The house had revealed itself, not as a place of refuge, but as a vessel of secrets too vast and dark to ignore. The basement door remained closed, but the veil was thinning. The silence was no longer safety, it was a promise, and the knocking was only the beginning.
The days that followed felt like walking through a waking nightmare, where every sound was amplified, and every shadow a whispered threat. The house no longer simply held her, it enveloped her, its silent pulse beating through the walls and floor, an endless rhythm that had become the soundtrack to her existence. The tapping had stopped, but something worse had taken its place, a heavy, suffocating stillness that pressed on her chest, stealing her breath and clouding her mind. She tried to reach out, to friends, to strangers, even to the strangers in her own memories, but found herself sinking deeper into isolation. The house demanded silence, and she was its captive. She found herself drawn to the attic again, to the bundle of letters she had hidden away. She unfolded them, tracing the faded ink, as if seeking answers in the trembling script. The writers spoke of fear and resignation, of families bound to the land by secrets too terrible to name. One letter told of a child who had vanished beneath the floorboards, taken by a presence that whispered promises of power and safety in exchange for silence. Another spoke of a ritual, an offering made every generation to keep the darkness at bay. The writer's hands had trembled as they wrote the words, "Break the silence, and you break the seal." Her own hands shook as she read, realizing that her every action, every thought, was unraveling the fragile balance her ancestors had fought to maintain. That night, sleep eluded her completely. The house seemed to breathe around her, its wooden ribs creaking with secrets and sorrow. In the darkness, the faintest glow began to pulse beneath the floorboards, like a heartbeat seen through thick skin. The sealed basement door groaned softly, as if protesting against its confinement. And then the knocking began again, not frantic or angry, but slow and deliberate, a message encoded in every tap. She pressed her ear to the door, heart pounding, and felt the vibrations travel through her bones. It was a call she could not ignore, a summons that transcended fear and begged for understanding. The next morning, she found the third plank at her doorstep. Like the others, it was old, splintered, and marked with symbols she had only begun to comprehend. Across its surface was etched a new message: 3 pieces removed, 1 remains. The weight of those words crushed her, filling her with dread and a grim sense of inevitability. The seal was failing. The house was awakening,
and the entity beneath was closer than ever to breaking free. She understood then that she was no longer just a witness to this unfolding horror. She was an active participant, a key in a story that had been written long before she was born. In a moment of desperation, she sought answers beyond the physical world. She began researching ancient rites, folklore, and legends tied to the land. She discovered stories of guardians and watchers, of spirits bound to places by blood and silence. These entities were neither good nor evil. They were forces of nature, primal and indifferent, demanding respect and sacrifice. The house was one such sentinel, a vessel containing a power that could consume or protect, depending on the keeper's will. Her brother's disappearance, the knocking, the whispers, all were threads woven into this dark tapestry. To understand was to accept the price, and she wasn't sure she was ready to pay. Her reflections were interrupted by a dream that night, a descent into the earth beneath the house. She wandered through endless tunnels lined with glowing symbols, the air thick with ancient dust, and whispered prayers. The presence awaited her in a cavern deep beneath the foundation, a form shifting between shadow and light, its eyes reflecting the endless void. It did not speak, but offered a choice: to embrace the legacy and become its keeper, or to resist and risk the seal breaking entirely. She awoke with a start, sweat clinging to her skin, heart racing with the weight of the decision. The house was no longer just walls and floorboards. It was a living history, and she was at its center. As dawn broke, she stood once more before the basement door. The last plank remained nailed tight, the final barrier between the waking world and the darkness below. The air was thick with anticipation, the house holding its breath. She reached out, trembling to touch the wood, and felt a pulse that matched her own heartbeat. The silence was no longer empty, it was alive, and the knocking was only the beginning of what was to come. The final plank, weathered and worn, remained nailed across the basement door like a fragile barrier between two worlds. She stood before it, fingers trembling as she traced the grain that had absorbed countless secrets, countless silences. The house around her seemed to hold its breath, the walls pulsing faintly with a rhythm she could feel deep in her bones. The air was thick with expectation, as if the house itself waited to see what she would do next. She had lived too long in the presence of this silence to mistake it for peace. It was a living thing, a guardian and a predator, woven into the very fibers of the wood and stone beneath her feet. Her thoughts raced, memories of her brother's vanished smile mingling with the echo of the knocking that had started it all. She thought of the letters, the warnings scrawled by hands that had trembled centuries ago, the bloodlines that tied her to this place in ways she could not escape. The house was not just a home, it was a vessel of history and power, a crucible where past and present collided. The entity beneath the floor was patient. It had waited through generations, through fire and silence, through the passing of time that had tried to bury it deep. But now it was awake, and it was calling her name. Tears spilled freely as she knelt before the door, the weight of her lineage pressing down on her soul. She felt the pulse beneath the wood, the slow heartbeat that matched her own, and in that moment understood the terrible truth. She was bound to this place, as much a part of its story as the entity itself. To open the door was to unravel the seal, to invite the darkness in, or perhaps to finally confront what had waited patiently beneath the silence for so long. She did not want to be the one to break the barrier, but she also could not deny the truth that had been whispered to her in dreams and shadows. The silence could not last forever. She placed her hand over the final plank, feeling the tremor of life beneath it, the pressure mounting like the slow tightening of a noose. The house groaned softly, as if in warning or perhaps in mourning. Her breath hitched as the whispers rose, voices layered in grief and longing, urging her to remember the pact, to honor the blood and silence that had kept the darkness contained. She thought of the child in the letters, of the promises made and broken, of the sacrifices carved into the foundation stone beneath the house. The knocking was not a threat, it was a summons, a plea, an invitation to join a legacy older than time itself. Outside, the wind stirred, carrying with it the scent of rain and earth. The first drops began to fall, tapping softly against the windows like a gentle drumbeat. The house seemed to lean into the storm, its heartbeat growing stronger, louder, a song of life and death intertwined. She closed her eyes, listening to the rhythm that bound her to this place, feeling the weight of history and destiny settle around her like a shroud. The darkness beneath the sealed door was no longer a secret. It was a presence patient, eternal, and waiting. In the quiet that followed, she made her choice, not to open the door but to guard it, to hold the silence as fiercely as those who had come before her. The house exhaled, a slow, shuddering breath that echoed through the floorboards and walls. The knocking ceased, replaced by a profound stillness that was neither peace nor absence, but something more complex, a fragile truce between light and dark, past and present. She rose, her hands stained with dust and tears, and stepped back from the door. The legacy was hers to bear, the silence hers to keep. As dawn broke, the house stood silent and still, its secret sealed once more beneath the final plank. But the story was far from over. The house listened, waited, and remembered. And somewhere deep beneath the earth, the heartbeat continued, steady, patient, eternal. The knocking had been only the beginning. The house settled into an uneasy calm, but the calm was a mask stretched thin over deeper unrest. Each creak and sigh in the quiet house felt like a secret waiting to slip free, like the walls themselves were holding back a tide of memories too heavy to contain. She moved through the rooms with a strange new awareness, sensing the house not just as a place, but as a living, breathing entity, its heartbeat entwined with her own. The sealed basement door remained steadfast, but the energy around it was different now, charged, expectant, as if waiting for a storm no one could see yet. Sleep was elusive. Dreams came in fragments and shadows, carrying voices that were sometimes hers, sometimes not. They whispered of things buried beneath, forgotten rituals, lost children, promises etched in blood and silence. She saw fleeting images, a circle of stones, hands joined in ritual, a face blurred and distant calling out to her from the dark. Each morning she awoke with the weight of those voices pressing on her chest, a sorrow that was not hers alone but belonged to the house and everyone who had lived within its walls. The boundaries between past and present, self and other, had grown thin and fragile. During the days she pored over the letters again and the notes she'd taken from the archives. The story they told was one of sacrifice and secrecy, families bound to the land by dark pacts, guardians who kept watch over the boundary between worlds. The house was a sentinel and a tomb, a place where the living and the lost coexisted in uneasy balance. She understood now that the knocking was not random. It was a message, a call from something trapped yet conscious, waiting for the right moment, the right person to listen and respond. That person was her. A growing unease settled in her bones, a cold reminder that the house's silence was not safety, but a fragile ceasefire. The basement door's seal was still intact, but the energy it held was volatile, like a wound held together by thread. She felt it pulsing beneath the wood, a reminder that the darkness below was patient but relentless. The house was a labyrinth of secrets and stories, and she had only just begun to unravel its tangled threads. The legacy she bore was a weight heavier than she had imagined, a burden that demanded understanding, courage, and sacrifice. One evening, as dusk slipped into night, a sudden chill filled the air, and the lights flickered with an erratic pulse. The house seemed to inhale sharply, the silence breaking with a soft, insistent tapping, different from before, more deliberate, almost like a heartbeat speaking in code. She pressed her ear to the basement door, heart pounding, feeling the vibrations move through the wood and into her very soul. It was a summons she could no longer ignore, a call deeper than fear, a call to remember, to face what lay beneath the sealed floorboards. The knocking had returned, but now it was a rhythm she understood, a beginning, not an end. The knocking persisted, no longer distant but close, resonating through the very foundation of the house. Each tap was deliberate, steady, a rhythm that intertwined with her own heartbeat, until the two became indistinguishable. The sound seeped into her mind, stirring memories not her own, and awakening feelings buried deep beneath layers of time and silence. It was a language without words, an ancient call that bypassed reason and stirred something primal within her. She felt the pull of the darkness beneath the basement door, a force both terrifying and inexplicably familiar, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Her days were consumed by a restless search for answers. She revisited the faded letters, poring over every word, every scrawl of ink that spoke of sacrifice, secrets, and unspoken fears. One letter told of an ancestor who had sealed the basement, not to imprison evil, but to protect the family from what would happen if the seal were broken. Another described visions seen in the flicker of candlelight, faces in the shadows, hands reaching from beneath the floor, voices carried on the wind. She began to understand that the basement was not just a physical place, but a threshold between worlds, a veil thin enough to tear, and she was the one who held the key. Nights were no longer times of rest, but battlegrounds of will and memory. In her dreams, she descended a dark staircase lined with twisted roots and glowing symbols. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, and distant voices echoed through the caverns below. She saw fleeting images of children, lost, calling out, trapped between the walls of time. Sometimes the dream shifted, and she found herself standing before a door carved with the same symbols she had seen on the basement plank. Behind it, a dim light pulsed, steady and warm. The dream left her breathless and aching, a mixture of fear and longing swirling in her chest. She awoke with the imprint of the basement's secret heavy on her mind. Her waking hours blurred as the house tightened its grip around her thoughts. The walls seemed to breathe, the floorboards hummed beneath her feet, and the silence was filled with unsaid words. She found herself talking to the house, whispering questions into the stillness, hoping for answers she could barely comprehend. Sometimes the knocking responded, shifting in pattern or volume as if acknowledging her presence. The house was alive with memory, and she was a part of its story, both prisoner and keeper, bound by blood and silence. The weight of her family's legacy settled on her shoulders, heavier than the dust that coated the forgotten corners of the attic. In moments of despair, she sought solace in the world beyond the house, reaching out to neighbors and distant relatives. But her story was met with wary silence or polite dismissal, as if the very mention of the basement's secret invited an unspoken fear. The house's shadow stretched far beyond its walls, touching those who had tried to forget. and those who had failed to remember. She realized that some truths were too heavy to bear alone, yet sharing them risked unleashing forces better left dormant. Her isolation deepened, a reflection of the silence beneath the basement door, a silence that was no longer empty, but charged with expectation. As the knocking continued, growing ever more insistent, she knew the moment of reckoning was approaching. The house waited with her, its ancient heartbeat synchronized with hers, a fragile but unbreakable bond. The basement door stood as the last line between light and shadow, past and future, safety and chaos. She was no longer just a resident, she was a guardian of a legacy that demanded sacrifice and courage. The knocking was no longer a mystery, it was a call to action, a summons to face the darkness beneath the floorboards, and to confront the silence that had held her family captive for generations. The nights grew colder, the air thick with a silence that seemed to press against her skin like a physical weight. The knocking had become a steady pulse in her mind, a rhythm she could not escape. No matter how far she fled into restless sleep or distracted days, she found herself drawn again and again to the basement door, fingertips brushing the rough wood, nails worn thin against the stubborn nails that held it shut. Beneath the surface, she could feel a faint warmth pulsing, like a heartbeat that refused to be stilled. The house had become a living entity, part guardian, part prisoner, and she was its reluctant keeper. Memories, both her own and those not her own, washed over her like waves. Faces appeared in her dreams, faces of children with eyes full of sorrow, whispering names she could not remember but felt compelled to speak. She saw the same blurred face of a young girl reaching out from the shadows beneath the floor, a silent plea etched in the depths of her gaze. The letters she had found in the attic spoke of such children, lost souls bound to the house by unfulfilled promises and broken pacts. The house had trapped them, but it also held them safe from something darker, something waiting beyond the seal. She tried to hold on to reality, grounding herself in the familiar routines of daily life, but the lines between past and present, dream and waking, blurred further each day. The knocking was no longer confined to the basement door. It echoed through the walls, the floors, the very air she breathed. It was a call she could not ignore, a summons that carried with it the weight of generations. Her own heartbeat quickened in response, a fragile tether linking her to the entity below. She understood in a way that transcended words that the house was alive with memory and waiting for her to remember too. One evening, while sifting through old photographs and documents, she discovered a faded portrait tucked inside a worn book. It was a family picture, decades old, but something about it unsettled her. The eyes of the children in the photo seemed to follow her, their expressions hollow and haunted. In the background, barely visible, was the faint outline of a door, like the basement door, though the house in the picture had no such feature. It was a ghost within the photograph, a shadow of the house's secret reaching across time. Her breath caught as she realized the truth. The basement and its darkness were older than her family, older than the house itself. The nights became battlegrounds between fear and resolve. The whispers in her mind grew louder, voices pleading and warning in equal measure. She felt their presence brush against her skin like a cold breeze, their stories threading into her consciousness. The basement door remained sealed, but the seal was fragile, a thread stretched taut across centuries. She wondered how much longer it could hold, how much longer she could bear the weight of silence and secrets. The entity beneath was patient, but patience had limits. The knocking was not just a signal, it was a promise that the moment of reckoning was near. In the stillness of the night, she found herself speaking aloud to the house, as if it were a living confidant. She confessed her fears, her doubts, the overwhelming burden of legacy. The house listened, its walls humming softly with a presence that was neither malevolent nor kind, but ancient and eternal. She realized that the house was more than a prison or protector. It was a vessel of memory, a bridge between the living and the lost. Her role was no longer to fight or flee, but to understand, to bear witness to the stories buried beneath the floorboards, and to prepare for the darkness that waited patiently on the other side of the sealed door. As dawn's pale light seeped through the curtains, she stood once more before the basement door. The knocking had ceased, leaving a silence thick with promise and dread. She placed her palm flat against the wood, feeling the faint tremor of life beneath. The house and the entity within were waiting. For what? She did not know. But she understood that her story, the story of the house and the story of the basement, were forever intertwined. The silence was not an end, but a beginning. The knocking was no longer just sound. It was a call to face the past, to confront the darkness, and to claim her place in the legacy she could no longer deny. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows beneath the sealed basement door, where silence holds secrets and the past never truly stays buried. If you felt the chill of the knocking and the weight of the stories hidden deep beneath the floorboards, there's so much more waiting to be uncovered. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to dive into more in-depth history and mystery videos, where we unravel the untold tales lurking just beneath the surface. Stay curious, stay brave, and remember, the silence is only the beginning.